Now, what makes the National Intelligence Estimate unique is firstly, no other nation actually does this, but it also shows us what the thinking of US intelligence agencies is. So what threats are emerging, what they see as threats, and effectively what they will be advising the administration in America about. So it really tells a lot about the thinking of America, and that's what makes the National Intelligence Estimate important and worthy of consideration.
Welcome to Geopolitical Horizons, the podcast from thegeopolity.com. My name is Yusuf and I'm an analyst at the Geopolity. Now, every 4 years at the start of every new American administration, intelligence agencies, they put together a global trends estimate, which is like an assessment of where they think the world is headed over the next 2 decades. So, for example, in the 2008 reports, they warned us about a potential emergence of a pandemic originating from East Asia, and it would spread rapidly across the world. In this latest report, Global Trends 2040, they actually said that this pandemic has proved to be the most significant singular global disruption since World War II. Now, this report is titled A More Contested World, and that's due to a lot of problems that are arising because of climate change, aging population, disease, financial crisis, that the world will be a lot more divided. Now, here to discuss this with me today is the founder of Geopolity, Adnan Khan. How are you, Adnan?
I'm right, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well. We'll get straight into it. So, Adnan, I suppose the best place to start is, what is this National Intelligence Estimate all about? Why is it that they've started it? Why is it so important?
Okay, thank you. That's a good place to start, actually. So the National Intelligence Estimate is a quadrennial review, that's what they call it. So every 4 to 5 years, it's a report published by the National Intelligence Council. Now, the National Intelligence Council consists of all 18 US intelligence organizations. They make up the council. So this includes the NSA, National Security Agency, and the CIA. So it's a large body of intelligence specialists who have access to extraordinary privileged information. They also use publicly available information, but they also have access to intelligence data that only the 18 intelligence agencies of America have. So the National Intelligence Estimate is a report published by the National Intelligence Agencies of America. So every 4 years since the 1990s, they've published a report, and it's usually in line with when a new US president comes into power every 4 years. Now, what makes the National Intelligence Estimate unique is firstly, no other nation actually does this, but it also shows us what the thinking of US intelligence agencies is. So what threats are emerging, what they see as threats, and effectively what they will be advising the administration in America about. So it really tells a lot about the thinking of America, and that's what makes the National Intelligence Estimate important and worthy of consideration.
Now, it's a little bit confusing as to why intelligence agencies will be producing a report and then making it so public if it's to do with what US is thinking for their plan for the next 2 decades, the threats that they see. Should this be something public? Also, with it being such an important document, why hasn't it got more attention from news media?
So that's a good question, Yusuf. So what you find with the National Intelligence Estimate is it's talking about medium to long-term trends, not immediate trends. The intelligence which is secret is usually the more immediate. What's taking place now in China, what is Russia doing now. This is more about long to medium term, 20 years, which is a long period. And that's why you find the report focuses on more broader issues, climate, global economy, technology. It doesn't talk about Russia specifically. It doesn't talk about granular detail issues. So that's why it's actually a public document. So it's available to organizations, to universities, to everyone across America and the world, really. They don't necessarily see this as a secret thing. It's actually an open thing. It's actually to show what they're thinking, what their views are about what are the threats, what are not the threats. So it's not a hidden document. They don't see it like that at all. So although the word intelligence is mentioned regarding this, it's not immediate intelligence. That's what would be secret. That's what's classified. That's what takes 20, 30 years to be declassified. Now, you make a point about, funny enough, despite all of this, it's flown underneath most people's headlines. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, because of the major breakout of COVID in India, that got more media attention. So as a result, the National Intelligence Estimate didn't really get as much coverage as it usually does. I think the other thing also is the report was released during the same week. It was 100 days of office of Biden. So that got more attention. What has he done for the first 100 days? What did he promise and things like that? However, I think, already the pandemic was spoken about in the previous two documents. So it shows you that even if the document's not important now, it will still be important going forward because of the prediction it makes or some of the thinking it has as well. Just a final point. The National Intelligence Estimate doesn't make any policy prescriptions. All it does is it researches and analyzes what the trends are and what it perceives as potential threats and problems for America. It doesn't prescribe any solution, so it's completely partisan. It doesn't support any particular party, any particular political leaning. It's purely a threat analysis and a perceptions document. There's no policy prescription in there at all. Okay, so the report had a number of high-level findings. It concedes that the arrival of the post-American world is here. It also found, or it believes, that no single nation will control all regions of the world, which America has done really for the last 50, 60 years. It found that rival powers will all be jockeying for global power. It also found that the global pandemic has confirmed a lot of pre-pandemic trends, such as the economic trends of, most people in the world struggling with inequality and being in poverty, whilst you've got a 1% that seem to dominate the wealth situation of the world and the income scenario of the world. The report also found the reinforcement of nationalization and polarization. So we saw this with vaccine nationalism. We saw countries producing vaccines but not actually distributing them or selling them or exporting them. It also found deepening inequality around the world and strained governance. It also highlighted the failure of international cooperation and found the elevated role of non-state actors such as the Gates Foundation and private companies when it came to COVID. So the report, it grouped all these issues into 5 broad themes. So it found, number one, global challenges that don't respect borders, such as climate change, disease. It found fragmentation. So despite the world becoming more connected, people are not. It found actually people are resorting to nationalism and things that divide them rather than unite them. Number 3, what it called disequilibrium. So it found that there's a big mismatch at all levels between the challenges the people are facing and with the systems and organization needed to deal with them. Okay, then you had contestation, which is greater tension between communities and within them, and we saw a lot of this with Brexit. And then you had adaptation, which is that people will need to adapt to new tech, new economies, and new disruptions that are coming up. So the report actually spends most of its pages covering what it believes to be the major crucial trends for the next 2 decades. And these were 4: demographic, economic, climate, and technological. And that was really the broad or high level points that the actual report made.
Could you maybe go into a little bit more detail when you talk about the demographics? What were the main findings of the report?
So the report, it made a number of points regarding global demographics. So the world population at the moment is just coming up to 8 billion, and it finds that by 2040, world population would have grown to 9.2 billion. But it believes that there'll be more older people in the world than there are younger compared to now. Currently, 56% of the world lives in urban areas, and the report believes that 75% of the world will live in urban areas. So what this means is the budgets of the first world nations, the infrastructure, social services, all are going to face major challenges going forward. It also finds by 2040, only Asia and Africa will have increasing populations. Most of the world will start facing declining population, which is quite an interesting trend actually, because global population is going up. So the assumption area is the whole world, everywhere, the regions, population is increasing. But what you find is most of the world's population is actually in decline. It's actually a few large areas like Africa and Asia that are only increasing.
So Adnan, what does this tell us about fertility rates around the world?
So fertility rates is an interesting trend. So as far as research goes, you need about 2.1 births per woman for your population to remain static. So if the birth rate is higher than 2.1 births per woman, then your population increases. And if it's below that, your population starts to decrease. So what you find, a number of countries in the first world already have declining fertility rates. So Russia, Japan are already at the stage where the population is in decline. China actually had a decreasing population this year. So fertility rates have actually been dropping for a couple of decades. However, for global population to start decreasing, it will take the rest of the century. And the reason why that is in places like Africa, in Asia, and even a lot of the Muslim world, you find although the fertility rate is dropping, it hasn't dropped below 2.1 births per woman yet. So Iran, as an example, in the 70s and 80s had a birth rate of about 6 children per woman. Now it's down to about 3 births per woman. So although the fertility rate has dropped, it's not gone below the replacement rate of 2.1. So what you find is many of the countries that have driven population growth, although the fertility rate has dropped, although people are having fewer children, it's not dropped below 2.1 yet. And that's really going to take the rest of the century yet.
Okay, so this thing about population growth, the aging population, what does that actually mean for global powers?
So that's going to have a major impact. So if you think about it, the older your population is, you got a size of your labor force. So these are your 16-year-olds to your 65-year-olds. Now, if your 65-year-old plus are getting larger in your population, that means as people leave the workforce, they're not being replaced. So if your workforce is shrinking, the amount of people paying taxes is shrinking. The amount of people that can join the army is shrinking. The amount of people that can physically work and contribute towards the economy is shrinking. In fact, the number of people who leave the workforce, retire, they're going to require pensions. They're going to require social support. So what you're going to find is the first world is already seeing population decline, which is why taxation, pensions are already a big issue for them.
So I know there's a lot of talk of robotics actually trying to replace the much needed labour that they're going to lose because of the ageing population. Is there an actual solution in here?
So this is interesting. You'd think if your population is declining, then surely the solution is women should have more babies. Surely there should be policies to do with taxation and benefits that promote having more children. But what you're finding is this cultural view of children being a burden, of a woman's place being in the workplace rather than being a breadwinner. What you're seeing now is in places like Japan and Germany, they've looked at robotics replacing people who leave their workforce, or robots even helping the elderly. So they tried this in Japan, where you've got robots who act as maids in your home, and they're trialing it in Germany as well. So yeah, it is true, they are actually looking at this as an option. However, there's some cultural issues that remain. The general view amongst people across the world is that your children should take care of the elderly, not robots. So there are some cultural issues that are going to have to be overcome. In older pensioner homes, you don't have robots working there. You have physical people working there. You have employees working there. So there's a cultural issue that needs to be overcome. But for the moment, the high-tech nations like Japan and Germany, they've considered robotics as a solution to population decline. But I find it interesting that the solution to population decline isn't having more children. It's other high-tech solutions, which is quite interesting how this issue is being looked at.
Okay, let's go on to the next part of the report. What's the estimates predictions for the global economy?
So the economic story in the report was actually very depressing, more depressing than most of the report. It sees high sovereign debt continuing, which is going to leave governments little room to meet their citizens' needs. And it sees the global rule-based system being outdated, as inequalities get even worse.
So, why are the global debt levels so high? I'm guessing part of the reason would be the whole pandemic issue.
Definitely, that is the case. But global debt was high even prior to the global pandemic. And, when I was preparing for this podcast, I just had a look of who the highest debtor nations were in the world. And I was quite surprised. The top 10 nations, and I'll read them out in order. So this is total debt, yeah? Not debt compared to GDP. This is the actual debt. In order, it's America, Japan, China, Italy, France, UK, Germany, India, Brazil, and Canada. So these are also the largest economies in the world. These are also the largest producers of wealth in the world, who also happen to be the most indebted nations in the world. And there's a number of reasons why this is the case. These are also the countries that have the worst inequality in the world as well. So you find the top 1% and the top 10% own 50 to 60 to 75% of the economies or the wealth in these countries. So you find if you take a country like America, 330, 350 million people, if your top 10% own half the wealth, it means 300 million people have to only share in 50% of the country's wealth. So they will resort more and more to debt. You're finding that if these people are not earning much and they're paying low taxes, governments are having to borrow more in order to meet the needs of their citizens. So it's an interesting dynamic here. The largest economies in the world, a lot of the economies are actually being run on debt, which in the long run is going to cause lots of issues. It's going to cause more inequality. When you're going to have global competition, how is America going to compete with other countries when it's running on debt? So really, what you're seeing here is a lot of these premier nations, if you can call them that, they're setting themselves up for a lot of problems, which the report has identified in 2 decades' time.
Now, there's been a lot of talk about the global rules-based system and that it's struggling. Can you explain what that is firstly, and then why is it struggling?
So the global rules-based system is the term given to the global liberal order, which was established by America in the ruins and the ashes of World War II. America was the only man standing after World War II ended. Europe was obviously devastated. Germany was defeated. Britain and France were in ashes due to taking on the Nazis. Japan was defeated. America was the only nation standing, really, and you could say the Soviet Union as well. So America established an order with it at the center, and it called it the global liberal order. So it established the IMF and the World Bank, which were going to be development organizations to help the development along liberal lines. The United Nations was established as the global regulator between nations. Again, a lot of its policies were based upon global liberal values. You had NATO, which became the security organization. So all the Western nations joined NATO as a security organization, whilst the Soviet Union had a completely different one as well. So the global liberal order primarily was based upon an economic order. You had the IMF and the World Bank. You had open markets. You had open free trade. So America's position was, we will protect global supply lines. We will protect the sea lanes as long as you open your markets and you all freely trade. And this worked for the Western order. However, what you're seeing in 2000 onwards, there's been problems. And the primary problem being is the father of the order has been flouting the system. So you saw with the invasion of Iraq, America sidelined the United Nations. And when America invaded, it sidelined human rights. We saw this in Abu Ghraib. We saw this from Guantanamo Bay. So really, the reason why the global order is struggling is because the founder of it is flouting it. And the reason why the founder is flouting it is because America set up the global liberal order not for some benign reason, not because of his love of the world. Initially it set it up as an alternative to communism, but more importantly, it protected and supported American interests. And what American thinkers have found is the order just doesn't work like it used to. You've got middle tier nations like China, you've got Russia, you've got Turkey, you've got Mexico, you've got India. These countries seem to be getting more out of the liberal order than America has. In fact, many American manufacturers have moved production facilities abroad. So this was the whole Trump presidential strategy, that the liberal order doesn't work for America anymore. So he was openly calling for upending the liberal order. So yeah, the global rules-based system is struggling because the founder is flouting it.
So the global liberal order, are you finding that other nations are trying to dismantle it as well? Or is it something that actually is quite beneficial for other nations like you mentioned?
So other nations are not necessarily dismantling it, but what they do, they also flout it as well. So China, for example, is constantly told you got to abide by the global liberal order. It's part of the World Trade Organization. It plays by its rules. However, China also doesn't play by its rules when it suits it. So China, for example, manipulates its currency to keep it low. So as a result, most people have a trade deficit to China. So this was one of the arguments Trump used in his trade war with China, which is that you need to purchase more goods from us so we don't have a trade deficit. So China doesn't like being held to account on the values that the global order is built upon. So China has no problem being part of the global rules-based order, but it has a problem when it's accounted on human rights, on free trade, because it doesn't believe in these values. So the assumption that the rules-based order is based upon is you also believe in those values as well. But America itself has violated or flouted those values. So that's what's bringing the whole global liberal order into question.
Okay. Now, the report also covers the environment. Can you tell us what the report's conclusions were on that?
So climate has generally been ignored in previous publications, but now the National Intelligence saw it as something that's transforming global politics. So its findings include that governments are making lots of pledges when it comes to the climate, but it's not sticking to them. It's also finding that decarbonisation, the use of fossil fuels, is happening at a really slow pace, even slower than what countries have promised. It's finding that the transition from fossil fuels is needed, but this is impacting geopolitics, so it's getting in the way. And it also found that higher temperatures are leading to melting Arctic ice, and sea levels are rising, which is all going to impact land use, water use, and human health. So for the first time, actually, in its publication, it's really given attention to climate, which it thinks is going to be a big issue in 2 decades when it comes to global politics and nations.
Now, obviously, in line with this, there's a lot of countries talking about a shift towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. Why hasn't that happened yet? What are the barriers towards actually doing that?
So the main reason why it hasn't happened yet is renewable just doesn't give us our bang per buck compared to fossil fuels. So global transport runs on oil, and the petrol we get from our petrol stations, the amount we get per unit is just way more than what renewable energy could give us. Natural gas is used to fuel industry, and coal is used to produce most of our electricity. Renewable energy just cannot do that at the level that we need currently. So renewables is good, for the growth of energy use every year. The percentage growth is about 10% a year. Energy is good for that. But, solar power, wind power, it just can't give us the amount of energy we need per unit currently. And that's why the transition has been really, really slow. There is another issue as well. Whole technologies have been built around these energies. So transport is based around petrol. Transport isn't based around solar. It's not based around electricity, although you're getting more electric vehicles. But the transition will happen a lot more slowly, and a lot of it comes down to economies of scale as well. But fundamentally, oil is still going to be the fuel of choice for transport. Gas will still be the fuel of choice for industry. And for electricity, coal will still be the fuel of choice. What you will find, though, that the percentage increase use every year, that will probably be replaced by renewable energy. But renewable energy just cannot, if you scale it up, it just can't, fulfill what we need for the modern day industry.
I guess the energy consumption is just only going to increase globally because of the population rise as well.
Yes, there's some truth to that as well. But if you look at the numbers, you'll find that most of the consumption is actually done by the West, which is about 20 to 30% of the world population. The vast majority of the world's population does not consume most of the energy. A minority of the world's population, which is in the West, they consume 75% of the world's consumption. So there's a complete mismatch there. So this has always been the assumption that as the population grows, we're going to consume more and we're going to run out of oil, we're going to run out of gas, we're going to run out of food. Well, that hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened because most of the world, for example, today, 3 billion people in the world, half the world's population will not be eating dinner because they live in poverty. So half the world is living in poverty. It's a small percentage of the world that consumes most of the energy. So Western consumption habits are the actual problem. That's what's causing problems with the climate. It's causing pollution problems. It's producing contamination problems. It's not actually the global population. Most of the global population struggle to make ends meet.
Okay, so the last section of the report, the last trend that it covered was that of technology. What were the main findings of the report in this?
Okay, so the report found that it sees artificial intelligence, network computing, machine learning, virtual reality, robotics, nanotech, 3D printing, space tech, smart materials, biotech, and others all will transform human life. All these, it believes, will exacerbate strategic competition between the US and China. It doesn't see that stopping. It sees new tech will also disrupt existing industries and jobs, just the way the internet did. It also sees space as being the new arena of competition. It sees expanding space exploration will take place in the next 2 decades, and it already sees China as a new space power.
Now, what is the role of technology when it comes to global powers?
So this is very important because you'll find that the global power has always been at the forefront of new emerging technologies. So the British Empire was at the forefront when it came to steamship, when it came to coal power. You see Germany was at the forefront when it came to chemicals. So in the era of data, in the era of sensors, in the era of robotics, whoever leads potentially will have an advantage over their adversaries. So America's nuclear capability, getting there first, had a major impact to be seen as a world power, and it got there before the Soviet Union did. And it likes to present that nuclear power and using the nuclear bomb is what ended World War II. So, whoever possesses and gets there first will have an advantage over their peers. So, whoever is able to conquer space, get weapons into space, they'll have an advantage over their adversaries. So technology has always been central to geopolitics and global power.
Now, you did mention something about the competition between US and China, and we always hear a lot about the China and US tech war. Where does this stand at the moment?
So America has started a trade war and a tech war with China. This happened under the Trump administration. And what Trump has done is he's banned trade in certain technologies with China. The problem America's got is because China is the cheapest place to make loads of components, a lot of these technologies such as 5G were made by Chinese companies in China. So at the moment, the tech war is really just starting. And what the tech war is to restrict access to China to these technologies, to restrict access to China to the intellectual aspect of these technologies. So China up till now historically has been the mass producer of these technologies. It doesn't necessarily have the blueprint. It doesn't necessarily have the know-how. Now China has a strategy, by 2025 to have a certain amount of technology made in China, and by 2050 to make the majority of these new techs in China. Now, these technologies I mentioned about AI and smart materials, if China's able to get there first, China will then have an advantage over America. And that's why it's inevitable China and Russia are going to run into each other. China wants to be the global power. China wants to use all the tools to be a global power. America is the global power. It wants to maintain that position and it wants to stop anyone else getting there. So restricting or physically banning China getting access to these technologies or getting access to the intellectual aspect of these technologies, that's really, this war started and it's going to continue really into the foreseeable future.
Do you think there was any trends that were missed by the report, any major trends going forward in the world?
So the report concluded that these four trends, climate, demographic, economic and technological, these were the main trends, and these will produce a more contested, fragmented and turbulent world. Interestingly, it didn't mention that politics will become more polarized and governments will struggle to meet expectations. But democracy is already on the ropes. What I did find that there was no talk of ideology. What's the future of ideology? What's the future of the global system? And even the failure of politics, what that means. So capitalism or liberalism as a system is seen as rigged by most people in the world. Most people see it's not working, and that's why they turn to unconventional candidates in the hope that things will change. That's why people like Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Imran Khan in Pakistan even got into power. But there was very little talk about this in the report. And that's probably because these are philosophical ideas, and the National Intelligence Estimate focuses more on tangible things, the environment, the economy, technology. But what's interesting is Russia and China, as an example, despite the threat they pose to America and the global system, they don't pose an ideological challenge. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's not exporting communism. China really didn't even engage in exporting communism in the first time round. At the moment, it doesn't pose an ideological challenge to America. It's not saying to America, we have a different system for the world. We have a different system the world should be organized upon. It's not engaging in trade with the world and saying you should join our ideological framework. So although sometimes you hear America is the liberal and China is the authoritarian leader, but China's not even exporting its politics. It's not saying the political setup China has, you should have that as well. All China's really doing is engaging in trade around the world and is bumping up against America. Now, what's interesting is the only people that have an alternative ideology are the Muslims. But for the moment, they lack their own nation and their own state to export this. And no Muslim nation has embraced Islam in its totality and taken that as its mission. You get rhetoric sometimes, but no one's actually doing that. So the report didn't cover this bit, which I thought would have been quite an interesting area, the role of ideology, what this means for global politics.
Now, you mentioned the Muslims and an alternative ideology, and you said that they actually lack a state, but a lot of people would argue the likes of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran actually present an alternative ideology. Wouldn't you class these as Islamic states?
Okay, so if we take Saudi and Iran first, Saudi presents itself as the leader of the Sunni world. Iran presents itself as the leader of the Shia world. And you find that both of them make reference to their version of Islam as and when needed. But what you find is Iran's foreign policy is not built upon Islam. Iran's foreign policy is built upon regime survival with some cover that is Islamic. And it's got some strategy in the Middle East, which the last of it is based upon Islam. Saudi Arabia is similar. Saudi Arabia, you find, its justification is Islam. Internally, it has some aspects of Islam, but its foreign policy, its economy, the last consideration is Islam. Its first consideration is the Saud family, the monarchy, and how it will survive. So it has no problem working with America, working with Israel, because it achieves its interests. And it's all about regime survival for them. And that's really the similar position with Turkey. Erdogan uses Islam because it resonates with the people. But his intervention in Syria had nothing to do with Islam. His intervention in Azerbaijan had nothing to do with Islam. His intervention in Libya, his relationship with America and Russia, Islam is the last consideration he actually has. So these countries have some Islam, which pleases the people, but they are not Islamic states. They are not exporting Islam. They are not doing what the Soviet Union did of exporting communism. They're not exporting Islam like that.
Now, this report, going off the major trends that it presented, it tried to present some possible scenarios that the world could be in the year 2040. I actually found this very interesting. Could you go through some of these scenarios and how likely they are to come true?
So, yeah, the report provides, usually the National Intelligence Estimates always gives alternative scenarios, which is always quite an interesting read. And in this report, it gave 5 scenarios of varying degrees of plausibility, yeah? Some more likely and others very, very unlikely. So its first scenario was what it called a world adrift. This is a scenario where the international system is directionless, it's chaotic, it's volatile, as international rules and institutions are largely ignored. Now, we're not at that stage yet, but you can see some of that already, with America flouting the UN and human rights. The second scenario was what they call separate silos. So this is a world that's fragmented into several economic and security blocks of varying sizes and strength, and they're centered on the US, China, EU and Russia, and a few regional powers, and focused on self-sufficiency, resiliency and defense. So some of this, we're seeing it already. You're seeing some of this at the EU level. You're seeing this between China and Russia as well. So although this is a scenario for 2040, you can see some of it already. The third one is what they call tragedy and mobilization. So this is a global coalition led by the EU and China, working with NGOs and revitalizing the multilateral institutions, yeah? So very positive about the future, yeah, but very, very unlikely. Because at the moment, the way the trends are is global institutions are falling apart. They are struggling for their survival. So the fourth one, and probably, we're getting to the unlikely scenarios now, is what they call competitive coexistence. So the US and China have prioritized economic growth and restored a robust trading relationship. So this is similar to the détente that occurred between the Soviet Union and America, I believe in the 1960s, where they agreed to split the world into 2 blocks and coexist with each other, yeah, which lasted for a few years until they started competing with each other. So it's happened in the past. It's unlikely because it means China needs to give up some of its ambition. And then the last one, and probably the most unlikely, is what they called, and I think it was probably just being a bit too optimistic, they called it a renaissance of democracy. So this is where the world is in the midst of a resurgence of open democracies led by the US and its allies. Very unlikely because firstly, democracy has been undermined in so many ways. Many, many people can see democracy just doesn't work for them. And the US being at the center of the renaissance of democracy is quite hard to believe, considering how the American system is and considering how rigged the American system is. And this is how it's seen by the people as well. So these scenarios are a good way of giving something practical in the National Intelligence Report. They do this every 4 years. In every report, they have these scenarios of how the world will be. And it's just an interesting read of how they actually see it. And what's good is they've given a couple of scenarios with varying degrees of plausibility. So yeah, rather interesting read, but obviously all of this is based upon how they see things with the trends currently. Obviously things can change.
Now, obviously, this report was made by US intelligence agencies for the administration. Would the US actually look at these potential scenarios in the future and try to kind of tailor their policies to aim for one of these things? So, for example, the last one you said is unlikely, the renaissance of democracy, but would the US be trying to aim for that?
Yeah, so it comes to again idealism versus realism. The American thinkers will always be idealistic with their values, but what you find is realism always trumps reality. So you find, for example, previous reports talked about non-state actors well before ISIS. Even the caliphate was spoken about in 2004, 2005. In fact, it predicted the re-emergence of the caliphate now, in this year, 2021. In a mock scenario, a discussion between Osama bin Laden and Gandhi and how they would discuss it. So what you find is because the presidential cycle in America is every 4 years, presidents get really busy with their day-to-day running of the country. So they don't, no ruler is going to be looking at where the country will be in 20 years' time. That's really the job of the permanent elements of the American system. So you're looking at the State Department, you're looking at the Pentagon, you're looking at generals and officials who are not affected by the election cycle. They are the people that think more long term. Presidents really are thinking 4 years, 5 years max. What are the challenges I face? What are the tangible challenges I face? But this is needed because you can't just be ping-ponging from daily challenges. There's got to be some long-term thinking. What are the long-term trends? So America is interesting. It's a country that has a system that's institutionalized where reports are produced to look at long-term trends. And all of this is an indicator of a nation that does think long-term, even if individuals don't look long-term and even if presidents come and go. But America as a system has a process in place, National Intelligence Estimate, that looks at medium to long-term trends.
Thank you for your time today, Adnan. It was good talking to you. If you want to learn more about the issues raised today, please check out our website, www.thegeopolity.com, all one word. You can also learn more on other issues by accessing our website, where you'll find comprehensive insights. Thank you for listening.